My side, thank you very much to Sustainable Seas Trust and to the Africa Marine Waste Network for the opportunity to present on this topic today. It really is feedback on the development and the outcomes of the Africa Waste Management Outlook, which was published last year. And also just in addition to show some of the additional insights and information that was gathered during that process, particularly as it relates to single-use plastic. And so the topic of my presentation today is around the state and impact of waste management in Africa and the growing problem of single-use plastic that we see. So those that are not necessarily familiar with the Africa Waste Management Outlook, it was an initiative of the United Nations Environment Programme, and it was released or published last year in June on World Environment Day. And it was really in response to the need that was identified in the first global waste management outlook, which was the need for greater detail on waste management issues, specifically at the regional level. And since then, we've seen a number of regional outlooks published for different areas globally. The Africa Waste Management Outlook was written by a number of authors from across Africa. I was the coordinating lead author of the Africa Outlook, and it really tried to gather as much information as we possibly could around the state of solid waste management, around waste governance issues. Very important to us to look at the impacts that waste is having in Africa, and then to leave a positive message as well with regards to this topic around waste as resource and appropriate solutions for Africa as we move forward. And ultimately, at the end of the day, how we actually finance this, because without the financial support to drive this, it's extremely difficult for us to address these kinds of challenges. I seem to be having a... There we go. So one of the things that we're seeing from a lot of the international literature being published is that we're expecting Africa to undergo major transformation over the coming century. We're expecting significant population increase. We're seeing significant urbanization and migration of people towards cities, and we're expecting consumer purchasing habits to change. And this is expected to lead to exponential growth in waste management. In fact, this growth is expected to be so significant that it almost doesn't matter what other regions are doing globally. It will be overshadowed by what is happening in Africa. And if you look at the graph in the top left-hand corner of the slide, the dotted blue line is the total municipal solid waste generation for the region for sub-Saharan Africa. And you can see the significant increase that's expected, that by the time we get to around 2070, 2080, it really has exceeded what other regions are producing in terms of waste generation. And this is likely to place incredible burden on what is considered to be already very strained waste infrastructure in African cities and towns. If you look at where this population-driven growth is expected to be, according to the UN, 10 countries are expected to account collectively for more than half the world's projected population growth. 6 of these are in Africa, starting first of all with Nigeria. You can see the figures there. Major expected population growth for Nigeria, a country already facing significant waste management challenges. The DRC, we've got Ethiopia, Tanzania, Uganda, and Egypt. So major population growth in these African countries. Chapters 3 and 5 of the Africa Waste Management Outlook really try to consolidate the state and impact. And I will say that we really struggled to find reliable waste data and information for Africa. It's an issue and a concern that we've had, and we really have to find mechanisms to overcome this. But what we are seeing from the information that is available is that current waste management practices are causing significant social, economic, and environmental impacts. However, we don't have data on the cost of inaction. From the preliminary information that we've got, we expect that cost of inaction to be significant for Africa, but we just don't yet have a reliable number. The particular kind of waste streams of concern which emerged during the course of this, hazardous waste streams which we see migrating into Africa and being dumped in Africa. There's a particular problem around electronic waste, particularly if you get up into the areas of Nigeria, Ghana, Cote d'Ivoire. We're seeing e-waste move in and a kind of informal dismantling and refurbishment, reuse, repair of e-waste. Single-use plastics, which I'll touch on today, and then obviously organic waste, wet organic biomass, which is a particular concern in that currently there's very little application, very little use of organic waste in Africa, but a significant component of the waste that is being generated. From the data that was available, on average, we're seeing around about 13% of municipal solid waste in Africa is plastic waste, the bulk of which is dumped. And if anyone's been to, I don't want to say a landfill site because very often they're more dump sites. If anyone's been to a disposal site in Africa, you'll see photos like this where there's still a lot of plastic, a lot of viable recyclable material ending up in these sites. We see an average waste collection rate of only 55% for municipal solid waste in African countries. This photo taken by Costas in Kenya recently just shows the kind of illegal, uncontrolled dumping on the sides of streets in the absence of a formal waste removal service. We also know that more than 90% of all of the waste generated in Africa is disposed of to land, and as I mentioned, that's typically disposed of to uncontrolled or controlled dump sites, and very often, like this photo, in proximity to communities. We see open burning of waste, which causes significant air pollution, causes potential human health impacts, and we know contributes to changing climates. Particularly, again, in this photo, you can see the amount of plastic that is actually being burnt in this dump site. And we know that the indiscriminate dumping, the illegal dumping, fly tipping, whatever the term is that you're familiar with, in urban areas also creates risk of disease. We know from the evidence available that there's a direct correlation between diseases such as malaria, cholera, Zika, and proximity to dumping of waste. It also causes problems of flooding, and we've seen this on numerous occasions in the last year to two in Africa, and it causes environmental pollution issues. And these changing consumption patterns and this weak collection system that we have essentially results in the leakage of waste, and in this particular photo, in the leakage of plastic into our environment and ultimately out into our marine environment. According to Jambek and colleagues, 5 of the top 20 countries ranked by massive mismanaged plastic waste in 2010 were in Africa. You can see the significant contributors there coming from Egypt, Nigeria, Algeria, South Africa, Morocco. And this is only expected to get worse if you look at the move from the little green circles to the yellow-orange circles as we move forward, the forecast in terms of 2025. It was also important to look at issues of governance, the current legislative environment that is in place across Africa. And one of the things that we were seeing was essentially the inability of governments and also industry, business, to keep pace with these fast-growing waste streams, which is only going to get worse, and also to keep up in terms of the timely development and policies and strategies to deal with the increase in waste generation, but also new types of waste that are emerging and entering Africa. The response from many of the African countries, and many people will have seen this, we see this knee-jerk reaction happening across Africa, is to look at product bans, and particularly product bans around plastics. We also see very slow adoption of alternative policy instruments, things like economic incentives or disincentives, the adoption of extended producer responsibility, although we are starting to see some evidence of these kinds of alternative policy instruments emerging in Africa. The report that was published by the UN, also the middle of last year, that looked at bans on particular plastic products, notes that there are 29 countries in Africa that have already implemented some sort of regulation, whether that be at local, at the city level, the municipal level, or whether it be at national level, against plastics. And these regulations tend to vary. They might be a ban specifically on thin single-use plastic bags, and in cases they've set requirements with regards to bag thickness, or we've also seen some countries move to a complete ban on all plastic bags. And if you see the map on the left, the dark blue shaded are the countries, those 29 countries that have implemented some sort of regulation against typically plastic bags. The whole coast of the east, the whole eastern side of Africa there, having addressed this issue. But as I said, we wanted to also provide potential solutions with regards to how we could move forward as a continent. And so one of the important things was to look at the opportunity that waste presents as resource. and around diverting waste away from these dump sites into reuse, into recycling, into recovery. And the preliminary, we think this is a minimum figure, but the preliminary information that we have is that we could unlock a potential $8 billion into the African economy by diverting waste away from these dump sites into a secondary resources economy. We know that with that comes significant potential for socio-economic opportunities. And if done responsibly, at the same time, essentially killing two birds with one stone, we have the opportunity to address these significant environmental and human health issues that we're seeing. Again, photos like this are not unusual for dump sites and landfills in South Africa. Viable recyclable material on these dump sites, whether it be polymer, fiber, metals, nutrients that are sitting there, potentially available for reuse, recycling, and recovery. Currently, only an estimated 4% of the waste that is generated in Africa is currently recycled, and it's typically recycled by a very strong, very active, very efficient informal sector. The same applies for reuse as well, and I'll show you some photos on that later. The informal sector, we know, is very active across Africa, and therefore, as a result, it's really, really important that we look at how we integrate the informal sector into the waste economy, into the secondary resources economy to unlock these opportunities. It's something that we're looking at currently in South Africa around integration, very importantly, that we don't end up with these conflicting informal and formal systems in the waste economy. And then very importantly, the issue around appropriate solutions. Very often we see solutions coming in from developed countries. We've got some wonderful examples of white elephants when it comes to technology in the waste sector, technology that was implemented, and then we find after a short period of time, either after the withdrawal of donor funding, that either the organization, the NGO, the government, the business doesn't have the OPEX to continue to support and implement or to maintain that infrastructure. And if you go back there a year or 2 or 5 years later, you see that this infrastructure is either sitting idle or it's broken or it just hasn't been used. So what we're seeing is we wanted to document some of the social and technological innovations which we're seeing emerge from ground roots up in Africa. But what we're also seeing is that, unfortunately, the uptake of alternative waste treatment technologies is slow, and there are a number of reasons for that. But we believe that we actually need a combination. We need a combination of small-scale, low-cost, decentralized, community-driven initiatives. And we see this already happening quite strongly when it comes to organic waste, things like small-scale composting communities or small-scale anaerobic digestion biogas facilities, combined with larger scale, higher cost, more centralized initiatives. And we're starting to see some of these emerge in Africa as well. It's a particular problem when it comes to plastic, and I think probably one of the greatest innovation challenges facing us in the 21st century is how we can potentially deal with waste plastic in a decentralized way and at a community-driven level. Just to give you some examples of how we're seeing the social and technological innovation emerge in Africa, whether it be our informal collectors working at dump sites or at curbside in terms of collecting and essentially bridging the service chain and the value chain of introducing this recyclable material into the economy. We're seeing some really innovative transportation systems emerge as well, from small-scale trolleys that we're seeing, bicycles to little moped or motorbike driven vehicles. Some of these are from South Africa, from Ghana, from Nigeria that we're seeing emerging. In terms of separation, sorting systems as well, we're seeing these, again, if you visit dump sites, you'll see the informal sector very active in manually sorting the material. We're also seeing it at a community level in terms of cooperatives, communities coming together to collect. And then we're starting to see some of the larger sort of material recovery facilities, still very much manual labor intensive sorting facilities, but we're starting to see some MRFs appear on the continent as well. And then a variety of end-use markets that are also emerging in Africa. I love the photo on the top left of the school bag that is being produced from waste plastic material with the little solar panel light that creates visibility for children while they're walking to school in the morning. and on their way home, the little solar cell recharges, and they then have light to do their homework at home. An innovation emerging out of Africa. We're also seeing products like plastic wood. We're seeing it going into roof tiles, alternative construction material, the photo on the top right, and then some of the high-tech facilities that we're also seeing emerge, the first bottle-to-bottle food grade PET plants on the African continent. And on the bottom right, we've got the thermal waste treatment facility in Addis Ababa. And I suppose the question that's kind of around that facility at the moment is, is it sustainable? Will it continue to operate given the high levels of organic waste in there? What are the impacts in terms of the consumption of plastic and the potential livelihoods on informal waste collectors who are obviously looking for that plastic as their livelihood and their income stream? So I think we're paying close attention to these large-scale thermal treatment facilities as they do emerge on the African continent. One of the biggest problems, though, that we do face is the issue around poor financing of waste management. And unfortunately, Africa still is seen as a high-risk investment area. The types of figures that we were looking at for investment is somewhere between 6 and 42 billion to actually support these kinds of technologies that we need. And if you compare that to the 8 billion per annum that could potentially be unlocked into the economy, I think it's a fairly good return on investment, but I think the main reason is really because it is a high risk investment area. And because of that, it really is important that we drive public-private partnerships as we move forward in unlocking these opportunities. So in the document, when we wrapped up, it was quite clear to us that the kind of vision that the African Union has set forward of a 50% recycling rate by 2023, it is achievable if we start to focus on those opportunity waste streams like organic waste, around paper and packaging, things like plastic, driving a much stronger, refurbishment, repair, reuse kind of approach, particularly towards e-waste. We can achieve these types of targets. The vision that we set forward in the Africa Outlook, we believe that it is achievable around extending regular and reliable waste collection services. It's around stopping this leakage of waste into the environment. It's around the safe disposal of residual waste. And it's really around maximizing this opportunity that waste provides as resource. So the two focus areas of this was, the first one was around bringing waste under control and around at the same time harnessing the opportunities that waste presents as resource. But one of the things that really surprised me in the development of the Africa Waste Management Outlook was the level of interest, particularly from the public, from other researchers, academics, concerned citizens across Africa around this issue of plastic. And so as we were wrapping up, as we were starting to design and to lay out the document, we started receiving a lot of photos from people across the continent, from people that have traveled to Africa as well and have taken photos. And a lot of these photos, when you look at them, you can understand why we're seeing this reaction to plastic by governments, why we're seeing the desire to want to ban these kinds of materials. So I wanted to just give you some insights. These are the kinds of images. These are taken by as I said, by concerned citizens in various countries in Africa. So this one from Cameroon, we can just see in the absence of waste collection services, waste just being dumped within communities. And again, you can see plastic bags, HDP, LDP, a lot of single-use plastic in these photos. Again, a river just choked full of plastic bottles. Again, another river. You can see particularly in this photo, obviously there is not a market or a demand for green and brown PET bottles. You can see a lot of them floating, a lot of polystyrene, with what looks like industrial polystyrene also floating. Again, another river choked full of PET bottles. This was after a significant rainfall event that had happened that essentially just washed all of this, a lot of plastic again, just into the streets as stormwater systems just couldn't cope with the volumes of rainwater coming in. So again, a lot of this kind of highlights PET issues. but obviously this is what floats. So we don't necessarily get the full extent of the waste problem and the impact that it is having on the environment. And if anyone's recently seen, I think it was just last month, with the heavy rains that happened on the east coast of South Africa, a lot of the litter booms broke and a lot of the floating waste material just washed down to the coast. And there were, at least thankfully, there were significant cleanup events after this to try to reduce, or try to remove this waste material from the coastline. We're also seeing, though, as I said, we're also seeing a very active reuse. Particularly in this photo, you can see a lot of the plastic that's actually being salvaged, recovered off of these dump sites. It's being cleaned up and it's then being sold on curbsides like this, being made available for people to then purchase. This photo was of plastic bags that had been washed and put out in the sun to dry, with the potential again to reuse. So there is this very strong reuse culture in Africa, but typically driven by a very active informal sector. So, I think, as I said, when you look at photos like that, you can understand why governments feel the pressure, the need to move towards product bans. And I think it comes down to the fact, the reality is that if cities, towns, if communities in Africa, if we cannot move to a 100% collection rate, and I suppose many would argue that a 100% collection rate is not achievable, no matter where you are in the world, kind of thing. But particularly as we move into kind of rural areas where we also sit with the single-use plastic, if you don't have a 100% collection rate, you are going to continue to have leakage into the environment. And this really does leave governments with very little choice but to put product bans in place, particularly when it comes to these persistent waste streams like plastic, like single-use plastics. We're also seeing, though, and perhaps prompted by a lot of the discussion that's happening elsewhere in the world, for example, what we've seen come out of Europe recently, out of the UK, is we're starting to see this push, this prompt by concerned stakeholders for alternatives, and very often they're competing alternatives. So a very strong push to say, we actually need to reduce plastic consumption before it gets out of control. We need to look at product replacements, and there's a whole discussion around, biodegradables, benign materials, compostable materials. Are they truly biodegradable? That whole discussion, we could have a whole separate webinar just on that topic. Around issues, some people are saying, well, the only way we can solve this is to increase waste collection. Others are saying the only way we can solve this is to increase recycling and to create a demand for this material. So there are very different schools of thought when it comes to how we address the plastic problem, not only in Africa, but around the world. I think an additional issue that we have to face in Africa, though, is that these kinds of decisions in terms of, do we ban it, do we reduce consumption, do we replace it with a bio-benign material, are complicated by other factors. They're complicated by potential economic and job losses. If you do ban, what does that mean to local economies, to local manufacturing economies? What does it mean in terms of potential job losses in those sectors? And also, very importantly, what does it mean in terms of potential increased risk for food and water security? For very often, where bottled water is the only safe drinking water supply, what does it mean if we want to move towards potential PET bans? So these kinds of issues are important. They do need to be considered in this discussion in terms of how we deal with single-use plastics. But I think, all of the evidence to date suggests, if you look at the trends in waste management, if you look at the current challenges facing Africa, is that Africa could be the next Asia when it comes to single-use plastic leakage. We know that it's a particular problem across the Southeast Asia region and the leakage of plastic into our oceans. And I think, we know that now. We've got the foresight of how we potentially deal with this, that we don't end up in the same situation that Asia is currently finding themselves in when it comes to plastic. My personal opinion, I don't think that there's just one solution. I don't think that it's only bans. I think if we're really going to solve this plastic problem, and we're going to solve it now before it becomes a crisis on the continent, I think it really does require pulling all of the handbrakes. I think we need to look at how we reduce consumption where we can. Those products that will never be economically viable to recycle as plastic, how do we change those into other material substitutions? How do we have to absolutely increase collection on the continent, because it's not only a plastic issue. You could take plastic out the system, but you still have a waste collection issue. So how do we increase collection? And importantly, how do we unlock the opportunities that waste presents as resource, creating a secondary resources economy, creating a circular economy, whatever it is that you want to call it. But how do we get these resources back into our economy and to unlock the socio-economic opportunities that go with it? And I think given the position that I'm in terms of driving at least South Africa's waste research, development and innovation roadmap, is I do believe that we have to evidence these discussions and these decisions. I think very often they're emotive, and it can get clouded by a lot of issues. It can get clouded by agendas, whether those agendas be from civil society, from industry itself, from government, from business. We have to evidence these kinds of decisions to make sure that we are making the correct decisions, that we do understand the potential unintended consequences of the choices that we make. And so I think, from my side, that's really it. But I think we have to get this dialogue going in Africa, and I'd be very interested either now or post this webinar to hear from people in terms of what they think should be the solution for Africa when it comes to single-use plastics. What do you think that countries should be focusing their attention on in making sure that we essentially nip this problem in the bud, and that we do look at putting interventions in place? So from me, thank you very much for the opportunity to present on this. If anyone is interested in the Africa Outlook, if you haven't yet downloaded the documents, they are available on UNEP's website, or you can also contact either Stephanie or myself, and we can also share those documents with you. So from me, thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Linda. Wow. Yeah, as always, absolutely brilliant. And I know from our end in the office, we're all sitting on the edge of our seats and keen to perhaps get a discussion going on your question if you're still happy to do that. But I think first, if anyone from the audience would like to ask Linda a question, you can type the question in the chat and I'll read it out, or you can just unmute yourself and go ahead. Okay. I'm not seeing any questions popping up, Linda, so I don't know, do you want to just dive right into discussing?
Yes, I think if people that are listening in have any particular questions that they want to clarify, or if they have an opinion, and I'm sure everybody has an opinion on this issue, if people want to share their experience, perhaps there are people that are listening in that are working in Africa elsewhere that have practical experience on this topic. I'd love to hear from others, where they've encountered potential solutions of how we deal with the single-use plastic problem.
May I ask a question? This is Carl.
Hi, Carl.
Hi, Linda. Thank you so much. It's always thought-provoking to listen to you. Just a question in terms of the differences between the different countries. My impression is that South Africa is way ahead of the other countries on the continent. Is that a fair statement? And sort of who is number two and who is at the bottom of the heap, so to speak, in terms of dealing with it above and beyond just the sheer magnitude of the waste being generated?
Yes, it's a very good question, that, because yes, there absolutely are local, regional, national differences across Africa. I think it would be a fault on my side to assume that it's a homogeneous continent and all the problems that we face are the same. One of the things that we didn't want to do in the Africa Waste Management Outlook was to name and shame. But rather, to provide kind of a constructive approach. But I think that you are correct, at least from the evidence that I've seen, when it comes to driving recycling of plastic, I believe that South Africa is ahead of the game compared to other countries on the continent. And according to the last official statistics, at least that I've seen from Plastic South Africa, we have a collection and recycling rate on par with what we see in Europe, for example. Granted, that is driven off the back of a very active informal sector, and it's estimated that probably 80 to 90% of post-consumer paper and packaging in South Africa is collected by the informal sector. And I think the other thing is that we have seen industry step up in South Africa. We've had voluntary extended producer responsibility in South Africa I think for PET for probably a decade at least. And this voluntary EPR has allowed industry to create end-use markets, and that has created the demand for the material. I think what it's also done is it's created resilience, and we've seen this with the recent China, and I think just last month I heard India has also now banned the import of plastic, waste plastic. And so it's created somewhat of a resilience to these global shocks in the market, because we're exporting, I think maybe somewhere around 4 to 6% of waste plastic. The rest of it's actually being recycled in South Africa. And I think that's why a lot of countries in Africa are looking at what South Africa is doing. From what I understand, there's a similar kind of initiative to Petco, the PET recycling company, emerging in Kenya. I know that Ghana is also looking at solutions. We've just recently seen information in the media around initiatives being launched in Ghana. So a lot of these countries are recognizing we have a waste problem, but this waste does present a potential economic opportunity, and how do we actually put measures in place to increase recycling? Many countries, unfortunately, though, just given population size and distribution, don't actually generate enough waste to set up local recycling economies. And there, the whole issue around transboundary movement of waste starts to kick in. And so, what we've been saying is, how do you actually create regional secondary resources economies, kind of a SADC, Southern Africa, West Africa, North Africa, East Africa kind of economy, where if you don't generate sufficient waste, and in this case, sufficient plastic waste, to warrant setting up these the recycling infrastructures, how do you at least collect it, bulk it up, and then transport it to countries where that opportunity can be unlocked, but in a way that doesn't end up with what we've seen in Asia, where you're essentially dumping, polluted, dirty plastic into those countries.
Well, wonderful, but it sort of begs the question: a country like Nigeria, with like 5 times or 10 times as many people as South Africa, and presumably equal amount of waste being generated, when this is a flourishing industry, and again, according to the Plastics SA, these companies recycling plastics are profitable, the number is growing, and certainly there is a number of informal waste pickers who make a better living out of collecting the waste than they otherwise would. And just mind-boggling to me why that is not happening in big metropolitan area elsewhere in South Africa, such as Nairobi, such as in Nigeria. Is there any sort of obvious reason why not?
My gut feel would be because we haven't necessarily seen as much of the kind of private sector stepping up, in terms of the producers. I think we're seeing that now. And I think, my opinion, we're seeing it now because of the potential threat of bans. So it's almost been a case of they haven't had to, but now that there's a risk to their product, they're now looking at potential interventions to deal with that. Having said that, though, some of the greatest social innovations that we're seeing are actually emerging out of Nigeria. So I don't know if anyone's come across WeCyclers, for example, a young woman who started that initiative, and it really has scaled up in Nigeria. And again, how it's creating value for residents in Nigeria through the collection and the sale of those recyclables into the Nigerian economy. So we absolutely are seeing this, but obviously nowhere near the kind of scale and the potential that it has. I see there's also a question that I'm just having a look at the questions that have been raised. So I have to just.
I can read them out.
Okay, that'd be great. Thanks.
So Mary asks, I know, just so you know, that Tony's also burning to ask you a question from our end. But Mary Phillips asks, or says that I'm based in PE and have struggled with the local municipality to assist me with land space to expand and grow our education campaigns and collections. What has the Western Cape, Gauteng and Ekurhuleni done different to assist the SMMEs in the recycling space?
So I think this is one of the biggest challenges that we're facing in terms of the relationship with local government. And I'm going to be contentious here, and I'm going to say that I don't necessarily think that the Western Cape, Gauteng, Ekurhuleni are sort of much further ahead. I think that it's been an issue that has come up in the development of the guidelines for the integration of the informal sector, because the informal sector is saying we need space where we can sort this material, where we can store this material safely, where we can bulk it up, that we can get better prices. And they keep engaging with local authorities, with the municipalities for access to this kind of space. And they're not winning this battle. And my understanding from the municipalities, there's a number of reasons for this, whether it just be in terms of the ownership, who owns that land, but to, licensing requirements, waste licenses, environmental impact assessments that are needed. And it seems to be that there are a number of obstacles. I think there's also still a lot of uncertainty in terms of, who should be driving recycling. There's the discussion that in terms of the constitution, local authorities are responsible for waste. So anyone who's kind of accessing this waste, theoretically, they were arguing is kind of stealing this waste. So, there's just, I think that we need more clarity in the waste sector, at least in South Africa, in terms of the role of municipalities in this, the role of municipalities in separation at source, the role of municipalities in engaging with the informal sector, in engaging with citizens and with residents. And I think, at the end of the day, it really comes down to the current constraints that municipalities are facing across Africa. We recently had a delegation in South Africa from elsewhere on the continent, and one of the biggest challenges that they face is just getting revenue from the citizens for services. And without access to that funding, there's, they can't offer these kinds of waste interventions. They can't offer separation at source. They can't offer just general curbside collection. And we see this not only in waste, we see it with electricity, with water. How do you get residents to pay for services? And so at the end of the day, I think a lot of these issues are not actually waste issues, but they're basically kind of governance, municipal systems and operations kinds of issues. But Mary, I do feel your pain, and I don't necessarily have a solution for this, but I think that hopefully as we see kind of more policy and more leadership from government in this space, we'll start to overcome some of these obstacles.
Thank you so much, and definitely from our end, we're having difficulties in that regard as well. I would like to keep the questions kind of together according to themes. So Pia Nestrom asks, I guess she's asking you, Linda, directly, what responsibility does municipalities have regarding solving these waste management issues, and what should they be responsible for? I guess your opinion on that.
So, I have a very particular opinion on this one, and oddly, a lot of municipalities don't agree with me, and I don't understand why. But I say that tongue in cheek. My opinion with this is that I would prefer that municipalities focus on organic waste, on construction and demolition waste, and on residual waste, and in rendering services to collect those waste streams, and to leave producers and industry responsible through legislation for the collection of things like electronic waste, lighting, tires, paper, and packaging. That industry actually covers the cost and puts the mechanisms and the infrastructure and the systems in place to deal with the collection of those waste streams. A lot of municipalities, though, want to cling on for dear life to the recyclables because they see it as a potential revenue stream. But the problem is that they're not currently doing anything with it. And what we're seeing is that municipalities are typically the gatekeepers to this waste. If we didn't have an informal sector in Africa, we would not even be anywhere near the 4%, recycling rate, because the informal sector can get access to the waste that others can't. Almost every week I'm contacted by a recycling company or a waste management company saying, look, we've got solutions, we've got technologies, we've got end-use markets, but we can't get access to the waste because the municipalities kind of won't let us access it. And certainly in terms of our legislation in South Africa, unless the municipality kind of goes out on tender to do this, you can't just go and access the waste stream. So I would love to see more sort of voluntary and mandatory EPR. I'd love to see more private sector and business involvement, at least in the recyclable side, and to free up the resources in our already constrained municipalities to focus on the residual waste streams and to focus on those waste streams which don't necessarily have a producer, such as organic waste and C&D waste.
Great, great. Thanks so much. Tony agrees, he said. So then moving on to perhaps some other questions. So Sarah asks, she has two questions. We can start with the first. She wants to know how much of the plastic is produced on the continent. So I assume you're referring to mismanaged plastic, Sarah. Linda, your thoughts on that?
Okay, I actually read it as kind of virgin plastic. So I can address both. So in terms of kind of virgin plastic polymer, my understanding is that for many African countries, a lot of the plastic is essentially imported. I don't have information on whether Africa is a net importer of polymer. At least South Africa is a net importer of polymer, which kind of says, well then, why are we still continuing to send so much of the plastic waste to landfill? Just doesn't make sense, kind of from a balance of trade and economic perspective. Obviously, those countries that have kind of, if you get up into West Africa, your more oil-rich countries may be producing their own polymer plastic there. But there is a lot of importation of virgin plastic. In terms of waste plastic, there, in terms of what might be ending up on our beaches, shorelines, things like that, if you work on the assumption that 80% is actually coming from inland mismanagement, I would say the majority of waste plastic that we're seeing is locally produced. There obviously is dumping, and we see this particularly in North Africa and West Africa that are kind of closer to Europe, closer to the US, kind of closer to developed countries. We do know that there is dumping of waste into Africa. It's being dumped because there are weaknesses in legislation, so it's easier to get it in. And it's being dumped because the labor costs are lower in terms of recycling it. So very often we see this, we'll send our plastic to Africa because at the same time we're doing them a great favor of creating jobs. Well, that was kind of the approach with China, with India, with a lot of the Asian countries now. And we're seeing the environmental impacts of doing that. And I think more and more countries are actually going to say, hang on, wait a second, we're actually not prepared to take your waste plastic under this disguise of creating jobs.
Okay. Then to address Sarah's second question, what has been the public reception to bans in countries with bans in place? Have there been any countries where bans have failed? She's joining from the US, where the reception to bans is quite mixed based on location and have often failed or been blocked.
Yeah, so as I said, there've been some countries in Africa, Kenya, for example, Rwanda, I think Cameroon, all have kind of complete bans on plastic bags at least. But what we're seeing, at least what's coming out in the social media, in the general media, is that there are unintended consequences to this. From colleagues that I've spoken to in all three of these countries, there is now actually smuggling of plastic bags into the country. So there's kind of a black market, a trade in plastic bags, which I think, the consequences of that could be worse because now you have no collection and recycling infrastructure in place for this plastic because theoretically this plastic shouldn't exist. And I think, we're seeing this very often in the fact that a lot of our markets, people go and they buy their fruit and their vegetables daily from these kind of informal market areas, and it's convenient to put the material into these thin plastic bags. So the demand is there, the need for the material is there. So I think one's got to be very careful about the unintended consequences of doing this. Most of the bans have been around plastic bags. I think, there are other initiatives in place as well. If you go to Rwanda, for example, there's a very strong drive from the government around keeping the cities clean, about citizen involvement in keeping communities clean as well. And I think very often these kinds of initiatives have to go hand in hand of raising general kind of consumer awareness and understanding of why a government is doing what it's doing. We're also seeing a shift in some countries away from PET bottles back to glass. We're also seeing a ban on straws, for example, and a shift, and this kind of seems to have happened sort of voluntarily. We see businesses shifting towards paper straws, for example. In terms of consumer reaction to it, it depends on who the consumer is. So, perhaps that that top 1% of educated, wealthy, high LSM, they tend to welcome at least the bans that don't inconvenience them. So things like straws. But we are seeing some pushback, at least from people that we've interviewed. We are seeing pushbacks from some of the lower LSM groups who use, for example, plastic bags for many, many purposes other than just taking your groceries home once. They use it to carry books to school in. They use it to carry their lunches to work in. And so these bags tend to have kind of multiple uses. And in fact, colleagues of mine are currently busy with a life cycle sustainability analysis on carrier bags and these kinds of things like, well, how many times does a consumer in Africa actually use a plastic bag? Is it truly single use? How many times do they actually use it? So my short answer is, we're seeing mixed reactions depending on who the consumer is and definitely on kind of what is being banned. The South African government has indicated that they, for example, are looking at banning the top 10 most polluting single-use plastic items, very similar to what we've just seen come out of Europe. So kind of, your stirrers, your utensils, takeaway containers, balloon sticks, those kinds of things. So things that I think are easily replaceable with an alternative biobenign material.
Linda, this is Tony Rubink. Fantastic talk. Thank you very much indeed.
Hi, Tony. Thank you.
Linda, there are those plastics which are readily recyclable and are considered to be recyclable plastics. But in theory, all of them are recyclable, but not in Africa. And so the majority of plastics that end up in the dump after they've been sorted by the informal sector and even sorters at MRFs represent hundreds of tons, maybe hundreds of tons a day. And I wondered, what are the opportunities for getting some sort of thing in which we put in the plastics on the one end, even if they're a little bit dirty, and get out a product on the other end, which could be bricks or something else. To me, it'd be worthwhile even giving a prize to engineering organizations, or particularly the universities, to get something like that in place so that there is a product and there is a market for that product. Anyway, the big concern, I think, is those plastics that are not top of the list in terms of being recycled are actually constituting a huge, huge problem for us.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think it comes down to this definition of recyclability. Is it technically recyclable or is it economically recyclable? And I mean, if you just look at the photos that I showed you and the quantity of PET bottles, for example, ending up in our waterways, ending up being dumped on land, the immediate response when I look at that, at least coming from South Africa, where we have a 65% PET bottle recycling rate, is, how did that ever happen? Because that's just money sitting in the river. But obviously in those countries they don't have the end use market, they don't have the demand for this PET, and that's why it's just being thrown away. It has no value to people in those countries. So at the end of the day, it all comes down to the economics, unfortunately, around these end-of-life products. And so I think that one of the key things that we have to be doing is we have to be looking at how we create markets for these materials. Very often, unfortunately, we have to subsidize those markets, and then the question becomes, who subsidizes? Is it the municipality that subsidizes because of savings in airspace, landfill airspace? But we know that that's unlikely to happen because they don't even have the infrastructure capability, resources to collect the waste and send it to a proper landfill site, let alone starting to kind of subsidize a recycling value chain. And that's where I think that business has to step up. They have to step up in terms of how they help subsidize these end-use markets. And they have to step up in terms of saying, well, those products that are never going to be economically viable to recycle, we have to change that to something else that will be. We're seeing it, for example, with crisp packets, your chip packets. We're seeing it with sweet wrappers, all of those kinds of things that you see washed up on beaches, things that just don't have economic value. Why do we still have green and brown PET bottles in Africa if there's no demand for it? Why aren't we seeing the pushback of saying, if you're going to have PET on the market, it's got to be clear PET bottles? So we absolutely have to look at how we create improve the economics around this. And this is going to involve the private sector stepping up. It's going to involve policy coming from governments if they're not going to go the ban route. And it's going to involve these kind of public-private partnerships that we need on the continent.
Hi, Linda. This is Lauren from WWF.
Hi, Lauren.
I just want to ask about these voluntary agreements, and there are quite there's two that I know of at the moment that are being initiated in South Africa. But aligning that with legislation, do you perhaps have any examples of where voluntary agreements and legislation are enforced, and how are they working, and what's the dynamic between it? Because some people feel that voluntary agreements don't have a place when legislation kicks in. So I don't know, what are your thoughts on that?
Well, I think certainly in Africa, with the exception of kind of what we see already on the voluntary EPR, I'm not aware of any other voluntary agreements when it comes to waste or plastic in particular in the rest of Africa. I speak under correction, but certainly I haven't come across any between industry and kind of government business. I think that, voluntary agreements are usually a good way to start in the absence of legislation. It shows commitment from the different role players. It starts to set out kind of obligations and responsibilities of who will do what. And I think it gives the different parties kind of it frames the roles and responsibilities of the different parties. So I'm very supportive of kind of voluntary agreements in getting things going. Particularly if you don't kind of have all of the information yet in place, if you don't fully understand the unintended consequences, if you don't fully understand the landscape yet. But I think that at some point in time, that kind of transitions to possibly something more legally enforceable. Normally that happens kind of sooner rather than later if the voluntary agreements don't work. But, I understand I think it's in Japan, for example, where there's a voluntary agreement by industry that they will only use clear plastic bottles. And I think that's been in place for quite some time. And from what I understand, seems to be working quite successfully. And that's an industry initiative where kind of government hasn't had to kind of put legislation in place. So I think voluntary agreements are useful, but they shouldn't be seen as industry just kind of trying to keep people, or trying to keep government kind of quiet and kind of keep legislation, at bay. And if they're not successful, then obviously government needs to look at alternatives to achieve their objectives. My personal opinion.
Okay, thank you. May I ask one more question? Linda, around the data and the evidence, because we need evidence-based decisions around plastics. Do you feel that there is a lot of gaps in the data in South Africa? And just touching on, the stats that Plastics SA publish each year on the recycling, on the collected recyclables, and then studies from Department of Environmental Affairs, and then a study by UCT. I mean, there's a lot of discrepancies between all of those. How does one take that further? Do you feel that we need more transparency around data, or just your thoughts on that?
Yeah. So, I mean, across Africa, we have major challenges around lack of data, lack of reliable data, geographically comprehensive data. So, we've really got to encourage, I think we've got to encourage more research in this area. We've got to encourage people making data and information more publicly available across the continent, not only in South Africa, but across the continent. And unfortunately, working in the academic space is that there is a fair amount of research that's being done, but it never makes it into mainstream journals because it's coming from Africa, and perhaps the quality of writing is not necessarily as good as what you see coming out of developed countries. And so, I think the rejection rate is a lot higher, and with the result is that this kind of evidence never really makes it into the mainstream. So we have to find ways. One of the things that we were talking about was the potential to create an African journal professional of waste and resources or circular economy or waste, whatever you want to call it, but essentially creating a platform for African scientists to publish their research and make it kind of more available in the mainstream. So, you know, anything that we can do to make more data and information available, I think is fantastic. We absolutely, I think, also need to get industry and business to also share and make more information available. I think that, you know, I think there is kind of also there's misinformation that is fed into the system for different reasons, and I think we've got to be careful about this. We've got to be cautious of it, and I think, you know, in the absence of actually having kind of reliable waste information systems, you know, I always get very envious of when I look at what's coming out of kind of the European, you know, information and statistical systems. I get, you know, I just wish we could kind of have that for Africa or for South Africa. But I think that at the end of the day, you know, what we have to do is we kind of, you've got to start, you end up kind of triangulating the data. So it's a case of saying, well, I can't trust any one source alone. So, you know, if I compare what's coming out of other sources of data, do I get into the right kind of order of magnitude? And I think for now, you know, if we're just in the, if we're in the right kind of order of magnitude when it comes to these kinds of tonnages and recycling rates, that's probably about as good as we're going to get for now, unfortunately.
Thank you.
Thanks so much. So I think what that really does highlight is the need for uniform data collection, so that, you know, data sets are comparable. So Josh asks, he says, Linda, your presentation is intriguing. Do you think intervention funds should be placed in phases so that organizations that can afford to fund a particular phase can do so? For instance, how much is needed for plastic waste gathering and sorting before we talk about recycling? I believe the first two can be done at the community level in partnership with the informal sector. Having these phases clarified in terms of financial costs could help in the gradual fight against plastic waste. What do you think?
Okay, so I'm not sure that I fully understood the question, so my response may be off the mark. Just correct me if I end up doing that. But I think that, you know, in my mind, I think what we need to be doing is we need to be spending more of our energy and effort on actually creating the markets for the material. Because what we see is when you do that, the material kind of flows. And I think that was the choice that South Africa had to make under the voluntary EPR schemes. Do they invest the funds into the collection systems? And then once we've collected the waste, what do we do with it? I suppose similar to, you know, what Europe is kind of finding themselves in now. Or do we take that money and we invest it into the local end-use market, and we rely on the fact that we have a lot of unemployed, we have poor, we have an informal sector who will seek out a livelihood in this material. And that was the route that South Africa took, was to say, let us focus on creating the end-use markets and the material will flow. And I think that has worked. I think that it's worked well. There are many people who see this as kind of exploitation of the poorest of the poor and of kind of marginalized communities. But I think we're now at the point of saying, okay, you know, we've gotten this first part right, but now how do we actually extend that now into saying, how do we improve the livelihoods? How do we improve access in terms of quantity and quality to our sort of micro collectors, that at the end of the day, they actually gain more out of this and more out of the value of this material. So I'm not sure if that's answered the question. I'm hoping from my understanding.
Yeah, yeah, you're very close. Yeah, and what you're actually saying is we need to find the markets for the products first. Is that right?
Yes, and
okay.
I think, you know, my preference would be that we don't go look for those markets elsewhere off the continent, that we actually retain the resources and we retain the value on the African continent, and that we actually look at creating these markets in Africa, that we don't just export like other countries have done. But that is going to require the public and private sector to step up and start to subsidize these kinds of initiatives around end-use market development.
Okay, thank you very much.
There are also ways that, you know, we can help to do that by, for example, government policy with regards to what they buy. So, kind of preferential procurement for recycled products, recycled content. So you can help, establish these local end-use markets by saying, all plastic bags have to have a 20% recycled content, or PET bottles have to have recycled content. So, those kinds of policy statements help to create the demand as well. But I think there's already a lot of initiatives that I've seen, for example, around creating the plastic wood that goes into making park benches, walkways, all kinds of things. We see it going into making plastic pots. So there are a lot of innovative solutions that we're seeing. Telephone poles, for example. I think recently in Africa I saw there was a company making telephone poles out of waste plastic, essentially to help kind of save forests and virgin wood in the country.